Hello, everyone. My name is Chris Fraresso. I am a master's student of political science here at the University of Guelph. I want to express my gratitude for being included in the Guelph Classics Symposium this year. Although it's not my main area of interest, I always find the Greek and Roman stories very interesting, and I appreciate the intricacies of historical analysis. So I'm very excited to be here and to hear all the other presentations that'll be given. To give you a brief overview of my project, first I'll give you a gist of what my project actually entails, what the main things that I'm trying to look at, although there are other points of departure that you could go into for this kind of story analysis. I'm going to focus on the specific aspects of duty that I'll go over later. Then I'll give you an overview of the Battle of Thermopylae itself, the historical context in which it's situated, and its significance as well. I will then pour over the relevant sources for this analysis to present the different portrayals of the story, and more importantly, the concept of duty illustrated by those sources. The ones that I explore will be one of the main ones from the classical era, the histories written by Greek historian Herodotus, and the modern era movie 300, directed by Zack Snyder. Each has certain perspective and prose concerning the given Battle of Thermopylae. And I will lastly look at the main premise of this project, which is to look at the concept of duty, such as to one's nation, that pervades the story of the Spartans at Thermopylae. Duty to one's nation can be a formidable motivator, I will show, but the question is this always a good thing? I will analyze the perils of nationalisms that speak to more malicious forms of duty, and I will also demonstrate that what I consider the true heroism and tales such as these are those that demonstrate duty to a higher cause, such as to transcendent moral principles. So there are several different directions that one could go when looking at this particular story, especially as it pertains to different portrayals over time. For example, one could look at the pertinent theme of the role of woman in Sparta, or there's other problematic aspects of Spartan culture. For example, one could easily see the theme of toxic masculinity that comes out of the film depiction of the Spartans and being manly, or the history of Persia, which does include a respect for sovereignty and human rights. So insinuating the Persians as the exclusive arbiters of tyranny is a false and a misrepresentation. However, the focus of my piece is, in fact, narrow to the concept of duty and how it pertains to nationalism. So while historical accuracy and that kind of portrayal is important, and while it is important to note that history is often told by the victors, the main morale of my story is how the depictions relate to duty as the main point of departure. So now to focus on the Battle of Thermopylae. So around 480 BCE, preceded by threats of invasion by King Xerxes' father, Darius I, who had sent messengers to try and get Greek city-states to capitulate and submit to the Persian Empire. In 480 BCE, Xerxes followed through with a direct and substantial assault on Greece. King Leonidas of Sparta, who had been vocally resistant to Xerxes, along with the Athenians, such as Themistocles, led a small war band to the Hot Gates, or Thermopylae, in an attempt to slow the advance of the massive Persian invasion force. The numbers on each side are estimated at about 7,000 for Leonidas and the Greeks, compared to a sizable 70,000 or so Persians, according to Britannica. Herodotus had the numbers quite substantially higher than that, but can we necessarily blame him for fearing the giant Persian horde? The Hot Gates were a narrow stretch of land that rendered the massive size of the Persian army less effective, due to them being bottlenecked into a small passage. And for a few days, the Greeks were actually able to effectively defend the passage and inflict heavy losses on the Persians. However, the Greeks were then betrayed by a Greek named Ephialtes, who led a portion of the Persian army to outflank the Greek army through a hidden hill passageway, taking away the Greeks' main advantage of the small battle area. After deliberating, the Greeks decided to retreat, but 300 Spartans and still more Greeks remained, led by King Leonidas, since surrendering was against Spartan law and custom. And so the story of Leonidas and the Spartans at the Battle of Thermopylae stands today as an example of a small group taking on monumental odds in the name of a higher cause, namely freedom for the purposes of this project. So the depiction by Greek historian Herodotus is very descriptive in nature, which is pretty well established in his practice. He's a very descriptive and tries to provide a very objective account of the battle. He does, however, include discussion on how the Spartans' reputation portrayed them as loyal and courageous, a very specific kind of courageous, and there's actually a dialogue in Book 7 that he includes with the King Xerxes having a conversation with an ex-Greek named Demaratus. And in it he asks if they should actually be concerned about the Spartans, and sure enough, Demaratus says the Spartans are the fiercest warriors, and even though Xerxes was dismayed at this and laughed because of the sheer size of the Persian army, it goes to show that the Spartans were portrayed as very fierce and warriors willing to die for a substantial cause. So even though it does have less moral weight due to its descriptive nature, the representation by Herodotus can be understood as resistance by a small group against a conqueror trying to ensure freedom from tyranny. On the other hand, Zack Snyder's 300 movie in 2006 involves a lot more morally weighted statements, due in part to theatrics, of course, in trying to deliver the theme message of the Battle of Thermopylae in that kind of manner. But it shows the Persians, mainly Xerxes, as vicious, cruel, barbaric, and having a desire to dominate, which they did desire to conquer, of course, but then they also show the Spartans as instead emulating things such as honor, duty, and glory. Glory, of course, being that the best way to die was in service to one's country. Now, the concept of duty. So modern conceptions of the principle of duty typically nowadays have roots to Kantian deontological ethics, which postulates that you must follow certain rules. You must abide by principles that are universally true, that there's no exceptions to these moral principles. Kant in particular differentiates between hypothetical and categorical imperatives. Hypothetical imperatives on the one hand, things that you do out of desire because you want to do them, as opposed to categorical imperatives, which are things that you do acting on universal principles, like I said, no exceptions. For the purposes of this project, duty can be understood as having a fidelity to moral principle, especially ones which are fundamental and timeless, in other words, transcendental. So morality, these moral principles are constant over time. It can be difficult to flesh out what is meant by a higher cause, but it can be more or less understood as a cause dedicated to moral truths such as justice, freedom, self-determination, autonomy, and things like that. These things that can be understood as proper ends. So when it comes to nationalism, when it comes to fighting for one's nation, what is good and what is bad? If the fight is dedicated to what is best for the country, and its people, such as ensuring their freedom and self-determination, this is duty to a higher cause. On the other hand, if the fight is dedicated solely to a desire to keep things status quo or to maintain tradition, or the right to oppress, for example, these are things that are not a proper cause. These are not proper duty or fidelity to a higher cause. The ends, in other words, must be proper, which those familiar with deontological ethics might be confused at this point due to the nature of my analysis being based on duty, which usually means following the rules and focusing on proper means. So my analysis does differ a little bit, where I'm not focusing on the main action being universalizable, as Kant would have it, but instead whether the cause being advocated for is that which is moral and fundamental. In other words, what is the reason for the action? So duty in the story of Thermopylae, like I said before with Herodotus, it was a bit more descriptive. and he looks more at the what happened, what were the numbers, where were they, etc., instead of the why, or what was the reason or motivation for the action. On the other hand, the movie depiction 300 has a lot of good representation of what the why was. For example, service to Sparta, and you can see in the quotation in the slide there, for honor's sake, for duty's sake, for glory's sake, we march. These are all the reasons that we're fighting. And I would focus on the duty's sake for the purposes of this project, because they believed, based on that depiction, that there were certain things such as freedom, be fighting as free men and maintaining that freedom, that were essential and worth fighting for. I'll now turn to my analysis for the main argument of this project. So, sacrifice for a higher cause. As I've already hinted at, a higher cause is one in which the ends are devoted to transcendent fundamental principles of morality. And the examples I give are freedom, autonomy, and self-determination. Both sources depict the ardor to one's nation fighting for freedom against a tyrant. And there are other examples from history, even the same time period, for example, Cato, of fighting and dying even for the purposes of resisting a tyrant, who in that case was Julius Caesar. Herodotus does describe the duty of the Spartans. He does describe the fact that the Spartans were marching for Greece and to try and resist the oppressive conqueror that was approaching. But of course, as I mentioned, Zack Snyder's 300 does a far more thorough job in trying to hit home the concept of duty and trying to fight for these transcendent moral principles. And what can be implicated from both of these sources, and what might be reading between the lines of this story in general, is the Spartan recognition of their fates being intertwined with other people's. This expanded sense of empathy, their duty extrapolating to those other Greeks instead of just the Spartans, is a very important point of departure for this project, because fighting just for the Spartans in this case, while can still be considered noble if the cause, like I said, is to a higher cause, or higher moral principle, their ability to actually expand that sense of duty to others, the Greeks, for example, is a very, very important piece. And the contrast to that, also essential, is when it's sacrificed towards malicious ends. And so the whole main point of what I'm trying to get across, and in accordance with the main premise of this series of presentations focused on heroism, is that sacrifice does not amount to heroism when the ends to which that sacrifice is devoted are malicious by nature. So those that fought for the right to oppress, for example, on behalf of Xerxes, were fighting towards malicious ends. So even though they might have demonstrated some sacrifice or even courage on the battlefield, if you want to go as far as to say that, it is not heroism because the ends were malicious in nature. A modern example of this kind of story, of how it might parallel the story of Thermopylae, is the United States Civil War. So if you look at the Union soldiers who are fighting for the purposes of the abolition of slavery, can be recognized for heroism. Obviously, slavery, one of the most abhorrent things humans have ever been able to perpetrate. The abolition of slavery is a higher cause. In this case, the freedom and autonomy of the slaves. So those who are fighting for those moral reasons can be said to have been acting heroically, since that sacrifice was to a higher cause. The Confederate soldiers, on the other hand, despite having similar elements insofar as they were providing sacrifice, and they might have even been courageous on the battlefield since they were willing to lay down their lives, since they were doing so for a malicious cause or a malicious end, i.e. the preservation of slavery, it cannot be recognized as heroism. Their fight was for non-moral principles such as subjection and racism, therefore it cannot be recognized as heroic. And another modern example are the well-trodden analysis of the Nazis and their sacralization of national identity and the master race. So they did fight for their nation, to be sure, but they did so, of course, with malicious ends in mind. And there's so many to count, but extermination of inferior races, I think, is an easy place to start. And nevertheless, they fought with duty to their nation, and their primary motivator and the desire for their nation was that the nation was the advancement of a master race, and that's why they went to war, violating, of course, all kinds of higher moral principles. So, regardless of any potential sacrifice or courage, due to this malicious end, it cannot be recognized as uh, heroism. So, to conclude, though there may be issues with the story of the Spartans, such as their culture and treatment of slaves in their own societies, or the subjection of women, for example, although there was some very powerful women in their culture, a key takeaway from this particular story, as presented, is that of heroism, and that one ought to be willing to sacrifice for higher moral purpose, not for malicious ends. Nationalism, or service to one's country, is ever only morally worth pursuing when that sacrifice entails the betterment concordant with justice and other moral principles of that country. Thank you very much for listening. I very much look forward to hearing your thoughts on this, and I'll see you next week.